All right. Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. We are here today for our second webinar in our series of managing greenhouse gas emissions. Today, we're here to talk about Scope 3. So we've been calling September Scope-tember. It's kind of a fun play on all things greenhouse gas that we've been talking about in September. So, all right. Most of you know us, but if you happen to be new, I'm Jessie Cervi-Ortiz, the Managing Director of the Wisconsin Sustainable Business Council, and we are here to accelerate the integration of sustainability through business. So we do that in a variety of ways. Things like hosting webinars like this, primarily through the lens of education. We're really here to equip sustainability practitioners with the tools and resources they need to be successful. We have our Green Masters program, which is our tool that helps you measure and improve your sustainability or ESG metrics in your organization. And then we facilitate connection all through membership. So a few upcoming events as we turn towards the fourth quarter of the year. We really
Hey, Jesse's frozen for me.
I was like, is that me?
Yeah, likewise.
Okay. Um, Jesse, jump back in if your connection gets restored. But I can just share. So we have a virtual networking event coming up on October 10th at noon. And at the conference, as you all know, the conference is November 13th. We lost Jesse. So the conference is November 13th, and the day before the conference, we'll be having a change management session in person, also at Milwaukee Tool. And then the night before the conference, we have our awards event. So we'll be presenting Sustainable Business Awards and having a celebration of some participating companies. You can register for both of those, or I guess all three of those events, the conference, the award ceremony, and the activities the day before. Now, registration is live. All of those events will be in person in Milwaukee this year. The day before events will be at Milwaukee Tool, and the conference itself will be at the iconic Harley Garage. And with that, I don't know what other slides Jesse intended to share, but I will maybe turn it over to the first presenter up. Is that you, Kathleen, shaking your head?
Yeah, I'll take it from here. I think we had a quick intro slide to Be Local Wisconsin, which is co-host of this webinar series. So hello, everyone. I'm Kathleen Nickerson. I am the Director of Utility Partnerships at 3 Degrees and also a Be Local Wisconsin board member. And just a little bit about Be Local Wisconsin. We are a group of volunteers from local and non-local B Corp. Some of us have worked for companies whose headquarters are out of state, but we live and work here in Wisconsin. So Be Local Wisconsin is here to create connections, co-host events like this one that you're attending today, and just to increase the positive impact that the B Corps around the state are making. So we also have a couple of upcoming events that we wanted to highlight, and I will just put our link to our brand new refreshed website in the chat so you can check out those upcoming events. October 4th, we're having a virtual forum to build up our personal and community resilience during the upcoming election. And on October 4th, we're just hosting a happy hour at Lakefront Brewery, which is also a B Corp here in Milwaukee. So with that, yeah, I think we can turn it over to Tori and Brianna to at least share out the slide deck that you'll be presenting from, and I can kick that off as well.
Great, thank you.
All right, so oh, hang on. There we go. So obviously the reason we're all here, today's objective and agenda is to provide a thorough understanding about Scope 3 emissions and creating a roadmap to address those emissions. Sorry, I'm trying to read Jesse's notes while I'm talking here. So, but before we do that, let's get some quick introductions from Tori and Brianna from 3 Degrees, who will be presenting today.
I can start. Hi, everyone. I'm Tori Hoffmeister. I am a manager on 3 Degrees Global Business Solutions Climate Strategy team. I've been at 3 Degrees for about 3.5 years, and a lot of my work does focus on helping companies set net zero goals, which encompasses Scope 3, and then plan out how to achieve those goals, again, including their Scope 3 goals. So very excited to be talking about that in detail with all of you today. And I'll pass it to Brianna.
Thanks, Tori. Thanks, Kathleen. I'm Brianna Amoroso. I have been at 3 Degrees for also 3.5 years, just a month before Tori. And I'm a manager on our Power Markets team. So my role is to help my clients strategize and actually do the implementation, so the procurement of their renewable energy, and that goes for both Scopes 1 and 2. So I focus on renewable natural gas as well as renewable electricity procurement and purchases. So yeah, very happy to be here today. Back to you, Tori.
Kathleen, did you want to finish up with the intro of 3 Degrees, and then I'll take over for
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. So as I already mentioned a little bit about B Corps, 3 Degrees has been a certified B Corp since 2012. So we got in pretty much at early stages of the B Corp movement, and the movement has grown to over 8,500 companies across the globe who are using their business as a force for good. So we're super proud of that certification and really proud to be part of this movement. You can go on to the next slide. Just to give a little bit of information about 3 Degrees, in case you're not familiar with who we are as a company. So we deliver climate solution services across a wide range of companies who are working to address their climate impact, from utilities to Fortune 500s to small and medium businesses. We've been operating since 2002 and have over 300 employees, and now have offices in North America, Europe, and just most recently in Southeast Asia. And you can go on to the next slide. We have a number of different entities within 3 Degrees. We are experts in utility voluntary program design, helping utilities grow and market their voluntary renewable programs. We are a leader in renewable energy certificate supply, a strategic partner for supporting and developing carbon reduction and removal projects. And we also are a provider of transportation decarbonization solutions. So here to help companies like all of you address Scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. So with that, I will turn it over to Tori to dive into today's agenda.
Yes, thank you. Okay, so we're going to start with an overview of what Scope 3 emissions are, how they fit into the broader emission scopes that we first introduced last week, and how Scope 3 emissions are measured. So to start with that scopes refresher, greenhouse gas emissions are typically discussed and categorized using 3 scopes. They include Scope 1, which is direct emissions from emission sources that are owned or controlled by the reporting company. So that could be something like an owned fleet of vehicles. Scope 2 is indirect emissions from purchased electricity, steam, heat, and cooling. So the majority of Scope 2 emissions that we typically see are from purchased electricity. And finally, Scope 3, which again is today's focus, is basically everything else. All the indirect emissions from all upstream and downstream activities that are related to a company's business or its value chain. Next, we're gonna dive a bit deeper into all the categories of emissions that are covered in that Scope 3 bucket. So I'm actually just gonna walk through all of the categories here because I think it's an important foundation for the rest of our conversation today. And I do want to note upfront that to fully meet common accounting standards in the corporate climate action space as laid out by the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, a company does have to report emissions from all relevant Scope 3 categories, meaning that they do have to look at whether each of these categories are relevant to their business and justify any exclusions that they deem irrelevant. So it is important to understand every single one of these 15 categories. So first we have purchased goods and services. This is typically a really significant source of Scope 3 emissions, especially, for example, for companies in the professional services space. This is the emissions associated with the lifetime of any goods that a company purchases. So that could be even things like office furniture, computers, printer paper, etc. Next, we have capital goods, which is the emissions associated with any capital goods that a business needs to carry out its business. So this may be more relevant for companies that perhaps have some sort of manufacturing component or they need servers to do their business, that kind of thing. Next, we have fuel and energy related activities. These are emissions associated with any fuels or electricity that are captured in Scope 1 and 2, but these emissions are the ones not captured in the Scope 1 and 2 part of the inventory. So this would be, for example, emissions associated with electricity lost in transit to the reporting company. So not reported as part of its Scope 2, which looks at the energy that it's actually delivered. Next, we have upstream transportation and distribution. This is emissions associated with all of the transportation and distribution needed to get goods to a company before it creates its product. So this could be like transportation of component parts to a company. If it was a company distributing baked goods, for example, this would be transportation of the raw materials like milk and wheat to the company. Next, we have waste generated in operations. That one I think is a little bit more intuitive. It's just all of the emissions associated with waste a company generates, and that includes like waste from offices as well. Next, business travel and employee commuting. I'll just lump that in because I think those are both also very intuitive. Although I think it is important to note that business travel also can be a really significant source of emissions, especially for companies in the professional services sector where the rest of their footprint maybe isn't as extensive. Employee commuting, of course, that is the emissions associated with employees commuting to the office. It's actually optional, but not required to also include teleworking emissions in this category. So actually the emissions associated with powering an employee's home and work equipment while they're working from home. Next, we have upstream leased assets. These are emissions associated with assets that the company leases from another landlord. So for example, if they leased a WeWork space where they wouldn't have control over the Scope 2 emissions. And I'll also point out here that there's also category 13, which is downstream leased assets. And that's emissions associated with assets that the company owns and leases to landlords. So leases to others. So that's the case where the company is the landlord, but doesn't, again, control the Scope 1 and 2 emissions of the asset. So back now to category number 9, downstream transportation and distribution. This is emissions associated with the company sending its goods out the door and having them distributed either to the customer, being like a retailer, or it could be an end user. Number 10, we have processing of sold products. So if the company produces something that then goes into another manufacturing process, like maybe it's a dairy farm that sends milk to a dairy processor, those emissions have to be accounted for. Number 11 is use of sold products. So this is emissions associated with the use of sold products. So for example, if you're a company manufacturing cell phones or laptop computers, you actually are supposed to measure the emissions associated with the electricity that consumers use to charge those devices. Number 12, we have end-of-life treatment of sold products. So what happens to your sold products at the end of their useful lifetime, and what are the emissions associated with that? For example, for apparel companies, this can be a really significant source of emissions because a lot of apparel ends up landfilled, and they do have to account for those impacts. Downstream leased assets, we already talked about. 14 is franchises, so the emissions associated with franchises. So this would probably be most relevant for like a fast food chain or another company that uses a franchise business model. And then finally, investments. And this is actually intended to include all the emissions associated with investments that the company makes. So with that, I am going to move us on to a bit of an overview of how Scope 3 emissions usually show up within corporate inventories in different sectors. So in this chart on the left, you can see how Scope 1 and 2 emissions in the lighter blue tend to compare to Scope 3 emissions in the darker blue across different sectors. And the key point here is that on average, Scope 3 emissions make up about 75% of companies' total emissions inventories. And as you can see, that is even more extensive for a number of these sectors in terms of the outsized presence of Scope 3 relative to Scope 1 and 2. So financial services companies, for example, have way more significant Scope 3 likely associated with their investments and purchased goods and services needed to run their business than Scope 1 and 2. Energy companies have massive Scope 3, and that comes from use of sold products, which are fuels. And then you can see on the far right side, materials companies, so like manufacturing companies and utilities are those with the closest Scope 1 and 2 versus Scope 3, because they are much more likely to have significant manufacturing emissions or use of fuel emissions within their direct operations of Scopes 1 and 2. And then just some high level points here on the right on sort of where companies are with Scope 3 measurement and action right now. Many companies have already taken action to address their Scope 2 electricity emissions. That's seen as generally sort of a lower hanging fruit in terms of corporate action than Scope 3. But many companies have also begun to measure and set targets for Scope 3 emissions as well. A lot of the focus in that realm has been on collecting and improving Scope 3 data because it's much more difficult and complicated to measure Scope 3 emissions accurately compared to Scopes 1 and 2. And we'll get into why that is. And then finally, companies are realizing that it's time to act on Scope 3 now to meet their targets. So we're in a moment, I would say, where companies are taking a serious look on how to step on the gas on their Scope 3 reductions, especially as near-term targets are starting to come up quickly. 2030 is a big year for near-term targets that do include Scope 3. So why conduct a Scope 3 inventory? Why is this a worthwhile exercise, and why is Scope 3 important, aside from the fact that it does on average make up 75% of companies' inventories? So first, we have relevance. Understanding your organization's complete footprint empowers you to take action and meet the expectations of internal and external stakeholders. There's a widespread understanding now that because Scope 3 is so significant in so many companies' inventories, it really should be included in companies' climate strategies. Next, we have regulation, complying with rules that exist in certain jurisdictions. For example, the EU and California both now require disclosures of Scope 3 emissions, and preparing for regulations that have been proposed in other jurisdictions. So an example of this would be the SEC rule that was proposed to apply to publicly traded US companies. The rule is currently stayed and actually in its final form only applied to Scopes 1 and 2. But in its proposed form, it would have also applied to Scope 3. And I think that indicates that there is some potential for nationally required Scope 3 disclosures in the US in the future. Next, we have risk. Appreciating the risk factors associated with the ongoing net zero transition can better position you for long-term success and positive impact. So this is sort of saying, if you don't have an understanding of Scope 3, you may be at risk of not understanding what it will mean for your company to transition to net zero, if and when that is required by policy or required by expectations of investors and other company stakeholders like employees and customers. Next, we have innovation. Understanding your Scope 3 emissions will help you identify and understand new areas to invest in, for example, better product design. So this is, again, basically saying it's important to understand your footprint to understand the most impactful possible opportunities to reduce your emissions. And then finally, we have influence. Conducting a Scope 3 inventory increases your corporate influence towards decarbonization in your industry. Understanding your Scope 3 footprint will allow you to participate with others in your industry that have a similar understanding of where the most significant emission sources are for their peer companies. Okay, next, we're going to overview the basics of calculating Scope 3 emissions across all types of Scope 3 emissions. So to calculate Scope 3 emissions, that is total emissions from a given activity in a company's value chain. So this example should be considered to apply to a given activity. And I will actually share a specific example after I talk through this at a high level. But at a high level, two inputs are needed to calculate Scope 3 emissions from a given activity. One is an emission factor, which is a value that estimates the volume of emissions that are released into the atmosphere from one unit of one specific activity. The other component is some metric in the same units, indicating the amount of the specific activity whose emissions you are trying to calculate. And these are multiplied together to give emissions from a certain amount of a certain activity. So to walk through an example, to hopefully make that a little bit more understandable, let's say that a company wants to estimate emissions it has caused by transporting its goods by truck using a third-party logistics provider. So let's say this would be downstream transportation and distribution of a company's goods. The company knows that it spent $100,000 on truck transportation last year, and it can look up an emission factor from the EPA or from another publicly available database, saying that each dollar spent in the truck transportation sector releases about 1.56 kilograms of CO2 equivalent emissions. So then the company would multiply those two figures together, and they would come to an estimate of 156 metric tons of CO2 equivalent emissions from its trucking transport last year. Next, we will get into the different ways that companies can toggle these activity units and emission factor options to hopefully increase the accuracies of these calculations over time, and that is over years of conducting Scope 3 inventories. So here on the left of this spectrum, we have what we call a spend-based approach to calculating Scope 3 emissions. So that would be in line with the approach that we just went over, where a company takes the amount it spent in a certain sector and multiplies it by a spend-based emission factor. The benefit of taking that approach is that that data, that spend data, tends to be the easiest to collect internally at a company. So it often makes sense for companies to start their Scope 3 inventory journey with spend-based data. But the downside of that option is that it tends to be a less accurate method than some other options. And that's because a company's activities in a certain sector may not match a national average of emissions in that sector. And the other issue with a spend-based inventory is that the only way to show progress on your Scope 3 emissions would be to reduce spend, which is not really feasible for most companies. So in order to accurately reflect decarbonization opportunities and progress, companies tend to try to push along this spectrum, starting with spend-based data. And I should say also, even as companies evolve along the spectrum, usually some part of their inventory will still be spend-based, just because that's a great fallback estimate for when more specific data aren't available. So moving to the right, companies can switch to using industry average data And that means that they would, instead of collecting spend data internally, they would collect activity data internally. So instead of dollars spent on trucking, it would be miles traveled by trucks in distribution of the company's goods. And that allows use of a more accurate emission factor that actually looks at, average truck fuel consumption in the US, let's say. That data can be a little bit more difficult to collect internally and requires a higher level of stakeholder education on why are we conducting a scope 3 inventory? Why is it important to deliver this data to the sustainability team, et cetera? So that's why it's usually seen as the next step in a company's journey after starting with a spend-based inventory. And then on the right side in the darker blue, we have supplier-specific data methods. This is seen as the most accurate way to estimate scope 3 emissions, but it's also the hardest data to collect. And that's because it means that companies actually go out to their suppliers, reach out to their suppliers and ask them to provide them emissions data on the emissions that the supplier would allocate to the company for the goods or services they've provided to the company in a given year. The reason we also have mixed method under this umbrella of supplier-based data is because it's extremely difficult for companies to achieve a 100% supplier-based data inventory. So what we often see is that companies will start collecting supplier-specific data and still have other mixed method data, so industry average data or spend-based data in their inventory as they work on increasing the proportion of supplier-specific data. Another way that we talk about that same evolution is moving from a simpler but less precise Scope 3 screen to an intensive but more exact Scope 3 inventory. So going over the term Scope 3 screen, this is where companies would typically use spend-based data. And the benefits of this is that it helps identify areas with the highest potential impact across the 15 Scope 3 categories. So it's sort of a first pass to help companies understand where their Scope 3 hotspots likely are. It's more off the shelf in that it utilizes open source data. Less data collection internally is required since spend-based data should be relatively easy to access. But on the other hand, it has a limited use in that its results should only be interpreted directionally to identify categories that should be prioritized for more intensive data collection efforts. Then on the other hand, we have the Scope 3 inventory, which would use the more precise forms of data that are trickier to collect, but more accurate that we talked about on the last slide. So that would be activity data and supplier-specific data. This would require data to be improved year over year to arrive at those more accurate Scope 3 inventory outputs over time. It would require greater internal or outsourced expertise and use more detailed calculation methods rather than just consistently multiplying dollars by spend-based emission factor. It requires much more data, including activity data specific to inputs in each category or supplier-specific data. And the main benefit of it is that it can be used to support more confident target setting and to actually track progress against Scope 3 reduction targets. So now we're going to move on to how a company can develop and implement a decarbonization roadmap for Scope 3 once it has begun to undertake those Scope 3 measurement approaches that we just went over. So step one is really preparatory work that we would recommend before endeavoring to collect the data that we just talked about. So that would be educating stakeholders about the importance of collecting Scope 3 data and setting a Scope 3 goal to sort of build internal buy-in on the importance of collecting relevant data before a sustainability team has to go out and ask, the procurement team and others for the data that they need. We also suggest that companies identify the goal and the timeline for their Scope 3 work. Are they aiming to set a public Scope 3 goal in the next year? Are they aiming to start disclosing their Scope 3 emissions in the next year? Is this a multi-year plan, et cetera? Then for step 3, we have collect data. Step 4, analyze data. So those are the steps that we just went over in depth. Step 5 is to look at that data and identify key results and insights. So if it's a scope 3 screen, the higher level approach that we talked about, those results might be, okay, it looks like category 1 purchase goods and services and category 6 business travel are our hotspots. So next year, let's prioritize getting supplier specific data for purchase goods and services and more specific activity data like air miles flown for business travel. Or if a company is a little bit more sophisticated in its scope 3 inventory, or let's say it has a really ambitious target to set a scope 3 goal that year, the key results or insights may be on the specific target that it's going to set for scope 3. And that leads us to step 6, which is to set a reduction goal and strategy. And before I move on from this slide, I want to note that I do see steps 3 through 6 as sort of a continuous loop. Companies don't just complete this once and then stick with their scope 3 insights based on that first inventory. Companies should endeavor to continue to improve the accuracy of their scope 3 inventory year over year, and then continue also to take a step back and say, okay, what are the key results and insights as that are reflected in this updated inventory? What does that mean for our goal? What does that mean for where we need to focus our efforts on reductions in order to achieve our goal if the goal is already set? So what would a high quality scope 3 decarbonization target actually look like if a company gets to the end of those chevrons and says, like, yes, it's time for us to set a scope 3 goal? So here we've highlighted the Science Based Targets Initiative's definition of an acceptable scope 3 target, both for the near term and for net zero, because the Science Based Targets Initiative is a really widely recognized framework for companies to set measurable, actionable, and time-bound goals that are aligned with the UN climate science and the Paris Agreement. UN climate science meaning the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Science-Based Targets Initiative is really seen as a gold standard for setting credible decarbonization targets for scopes 1, 2, and 3. And typically, if companies set scope 3 targets that are not aligned with the Science-Based Targets Initiative, it can raise questions as to why is the target not aligned? Does the target fall short of the requirements that SBTi has laid out? And SBTi also does actually validate submitted targets based on whether or not they align fully to the SBTi framework. So what does SBTi say about scope 3 targets? SBTi allows companies to set a near-term scope 3 target and a net zero target for scope 3, although the near-term target can be set alone. You don't have to set both a near-term and a net zero target. The near-term target is intended to reduce emissions over 5 to 10 years and to provide a milestone on the way to net zero. So the intention is to equip companies to ultimately achieve or set net zero targets. The requirement for scope 3 under a near-term SBTi line target is to cover at least 67% of scope 3, and then to reduce covered emissions in line with a net zero trajectory. And the exact required amount may differ by sector because SBTi does publish sector-specific pathways, but under its general pathway, for any base year after 2020, the required reduction amount is 2.5% per year. Then for the net zero target, SBTi requires companies to reduce emissions to net zero by 2050 or sooner by maxing out their emission reductions and then neutralizing residual emissions with permanent removal credits. Within these requirements, the scope 3 requirements are that scope 3 has to be covered by at least 90%. And those covered emissions must be also reduced by at least 90%. That's just how SBTi defines net zero for scope 3. And here we wanted to just include a graphic from SBTi that shows the general reduction trajectory required for scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. The same reduction trajectory is required for a net zero goal, although the required scope 1 and 2 coverage is slightly higher. And you can see, I think the key takeaway here is just that the extent of required reductions is so much greater than remaining or residual emissions that can be matched with permanent removals in the net zero year and beyond. So given that background on what high quality scope 3 target looks like, what are ways that companies can actually plan to achieve those targets? And SBTi actually laid out this framework that I think is really useful on 6 major categories of scope 3 emission reduction levers. And I'm going to step through each of these and talk through some high-level examples, and then I'm going to pass it to Brianna to take us through a more detailed example of what scope 3 implementation action could look like. So to talk through these categories here, I'll start from the left. First, we have business model innovation. So that could be something like setting an internal carbon price to incentivize decision-making that reduces scope 3 emissions, and investment in lower carbon projects. We also have operational policy choices. So that could be something like setting a travel policy that prioritizes rail travel over air travel when possible, or setting internal procurement policies. So that could be prioritizing procurement from suppliers with lower carbon footprints. And that brings us to supplier engagement, which is a major category of possible scope 3 reduction intervention in and of itself. So supplier engagement includes requesting emissions data from suppliers, which is necessary to get that most accurate type of inventory data we talked about, the supplier-specific emissions data, and also influencing suppliers to reduce their emissions. So that could be with carrots or sticks. So carrots could be empowering your suppliers to reduce their emissions by providing educational resources, creating an aggregation among suppliers, and supporting that process for suppliers to use renewable energy. Or it could be more on the sticks side, where there may be contractual consequences for suppliers that don't set an emission reduction target, for example. Next, we have procurement choices. This is the choice to purchase from lower emission suppliers or shift towards lower carbon alternative products. So if there isn't a lower emission supplier for a specific product a company's purchasing, they could consider shifting perhaps to an alternative but similar product. Next, we have customer engagement, and this would be most important for companies with really significant use of sold product emissions. This could be establishing customer buyback programs, designing packaging refill programs, so that would reduce packaging emissions, or it could even be working with customers to have them use renewable energy if there's really significant downstream use of sold products that requires electricity. And then finally, we have product and service design. So this would be designing products with lower emissions and or extending the lifespans of products to reduce their emissions over time. So perhaps before I pass it to Brianna for our more detailed example, I will pause there for any questions. So I realized that was a bunch of information. Okay, Brianna, maybe you can jump in and then we can open back up to questions at the end.
Sounds good. Thanks. So I will go ahead and speak to what Tori just gave us a bit of an overview of, which is supplier engagement as far as a way to tackle some of your scope 3 emissions. And Kathleen's going to drop a couple links into the chat that demonstrate the different ways that you can address your scope 3, the way that 3 Degrees approaches it. But one fruitful place is through supplier engagement. So if you go to the next slide, you'll remember this from last webinar, last week. But essentially, if you think about it, your scope 3, as we've learned, includes your suppliers' scope 1 and 2. So if you can help them implement scope 1 or scope 2 solutions, and again, scope 2 is more of the low-hanging fruit, so very likely it would be you would help them reduce their own scope 2 emissions, then that will address your scope 3. So let's go to the next slide. And this is our basic approach for supplier programs. So this is the full view of what a supplier renewable energy, so scope 2 program may look like. And depending on if you've, say, collected data, which as Tori explained, you will need to get that supplier specific data in order to be able to know even which suppliers you should be approaching about a program. But depending on where you are in your journey, you could jump into any of these phases. They all lead, of course, to taking action. And that action is going to either be done by you, the reporting company, whose scope 3 emissions you're trying to resolve are, or it's going to be the suppliers. So we talked a little bit about in the strategize section, you're going to have to measure and plan. So measurement, that's going to be that data collection piece. And then planning, that will be some of the actual, like how you want to set up your program. Tori already spoke to the carrots and sticks. We have found that few suppliers will act unless they receive a mandate with repercussions, unfortunately. But you know, such is life. That's okay. Having guardrails really helps your suppliers understand what you need from them, and hopefully there are good relationships there, and there are many ways to continue to build those relationships so that we can all end up where you're hoping to. So next in our engage and align phases, this is where we have found that suppliers need to be empowered, and you can do that in a few different ways. You can do that through educational support and explain to them what their options are and helping them understand the general landscape and then specifically for where they operate. Any strategy support in coming up with what will make the most sense for them, which renewable energy option will work best for them, or either finding or providing funding opportunities. We've seen companies say, okay, if hey supplier, if you can, you know, meet this target, then we'll make sure that our next contracts, you know, extend for the next 2 or 3 years versus just being an annual contract. Like there are many different ways that you can support your suppliers. And for taking action, those can be any of those options that we saw on the previous slide. So for example, unbundled REC purchases, you could buy it. You can help facilitate their purchase. You could buy it on behalf of suppliers, but they need to be retired on the supplier's behalf to count against their own scope 2. You can educate on available green power programs in their market from their utility or a third-party retailer. Or another way is to facilitate a power purchase agreement. We are actively engaged in supplier aggregations at 3 Degrees. So that is a increasingly popular way to address a lot of load at once for suppliers who can are willing to take on that sort of risk that comes with a power purchase agreement, wholesale market risk. But you can educate on any or all the options and then help them align themselves, and you can help them through understand what option is best for them. And with that, we will close, and I'll check the chat real quick to make sure there are any questions that are left. But feel free to drop them in the chat. I want to make sure Michelle has time to go over a case study. So I'll hand it over, Jesse, perhaps to you.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Sorry about getting kicked out earlier. Thanks for just carrying on. So thanks so much for that detailed description. It's just, you made it kind of clear and concise. Scope 3 can be so much and kind of confusing. And so I feel like that was just made it sound easy, even though we know it's not, right? And so, yeah, Michelle Miller from Simrise is here to kind of share about the journey that she's taken through Simrise in their Scope 3 mission. So, Michelle, feel free to share. And all right. Right now we see your screen. There you go. Oh, we see your presenter notes in that view.
Is it right if I just present like this? I'm
Yeah.
not sure. It should be okay.
Yeah, that works.
Yeah, so thanks, Jesse, for having me on today. So as just mentioned, I'm Michelle Miller. I'm the North America Sustainability Manager for a company called Symrise. We are a global supplier of fragrances, flavors, food and beverage, and cosmetic ingredients. So we are the go-between with a lot of the large CPGs. So, you know, we are in your consumer products that you use. Yeah, you just don't see our name behind it. So we are a global company. I am responsible for North America, specifically food and beverage only. We're a very large company, so it'd be a lot to handle all of it. So I just handle the food and beverage North America portion. Symrise has some lofty climate goals. I'm going to focus on the Scope 3 ones on this slide. So we have a long-term net zero target, which is by 2045. And then we have a near-term target of a 30% reduction of Scope 3 by 2030. And we are subscribed to SBTi with these goals. So how are we going to reach that? So our kind of mapping as step number one for us is really understanding what our scope 3 entails. Along with our scope 1 and 2 is quantifying all of our greenhouse gas emissions. Step 2 is our decarbonization journey, decreasing our carbon footprint through eco-design, product carbon footprint, calibration, and working with suppliers and our operations teams to reduce our emissions there. We have a lot of stakeholders that are interested in our carbon journey. So embarking on that with them, whether that's responding to their customer requests or working with our suppliers on decarbonizing their materials that we take in is all part of our journey. So our steps to scope 3, our reduction and mapping planning. This is really the getting into the specifics of how we go about doing it. Is first step is we set a scope. So we set a boundaries for how we're going to calculate scope 3. Choose an accounting method, gather our emission factors, run our scope 3 calculations, identify opportunities for reduction, and then gather our reduction opportunity details, as well as then mapping those reductions so that we can see where our trajectory is in line with our SBTi targets. So step number 1, setting our scope. So there's a lot of different scopes that you can take when you're starting out with scope 3. There's the cradle to cradle approach, the cradle to grave approach, and the cradle to gate approach. So Symrise, and not going into detail on all 3 of those, that hopefully you kind of understand the concepts there on what that means to be cradle to cradle, cradle to grave, or cradle to gate. Symrise has chose to be cradle to gate when it comes to our scope 3 assessment. So we look at the, since we are food and beverage, it goes all the way back to the crop that is harvested, then the transportation to the processing facility that we purchase from, the transportation to our units that process the material further, and then the freight that, the transportation that occurs from sending to our warehouses. So that is the scope boundary that we have decided on as a company to do our scope 3 assessment on. In terms of choosing an accounting method, I'm not going to stay on this slide too long, but we did choose the Greenhouse Gas Protocol's accounting method and reporting standard to follow. On this slide, I'll just point out that the scope 3 indirect upstream activities is where our focus with that cradle to gate approach lies then. Following the greenhouse gas protocol and doing that cradle to gate approach, we do, I just wanted to bring up that we do a quality assessment of all of our data. So we look at the data that we have, tracking whether it's very good, fair, or poor, and what our level of uncertainty is behind our data. We have a whole model and a whole graph, or not graph, a whole table that for each piece of information that we get, we track it against these uncertainty and these quality assessments so that we can try to improve every year. When it comes to our purchased goods, our emission factors that we use there has been a journey. We started out with spend-based or economic allocation. Then we moved to proxy emission factors, or the average emission factors out there in the sector. And now we're moving on to supplier specific emission factors. So it's been an evolving journey, and we've partnered with third-party experts and then with obviously our suppliers to move through that journey. When it comes to working with the proxy emission factors, obviously we mentioned that we're in the food space, so we use the World Food Database for a lot of our emission factors. That is a available database for us that we did research on. And worked with a third-party consultant to help us pull the right emission factors for our raw materials. So basically, we were able to take the pounds of raw material that we bring in on an annual basis and multiply that by the emission factors that we have identified from the World Food Database. When it comes to waste, we use the Greenhouse Gas Emission Factors Hub from the EPA. So they have a very nice emission factor hub out there where you can pull category 5 waste generated in operations and use their emission factors. They have a large list of materials that you can then take their emission factors to apply. We also use EcoInvent database through OpenLCA program to get some of our emission factors, especially for hazardous waste. And then we use the IPCC wastewater emission factors. And basically how we do this calculation is the volume of the waste multiplied by the emission factor. When it comes to emission factors for transportation, we use a formula approved by the EPA. So we use the following factors. We look at the distance that the trucks travel. We look at the load size of the trucks, so the volume per delivery or shipment. We use the US average emission factor for most of our fleet. Sometimes we have SmartWay data available as well, which is a program that you can participate in the US where the trucks submit their trucking information and it calculates their carbon footprint for you. And you can get their emission factors from the SmartWay program from the carriers. So we'll use the SmartWay emission factors, or we'll use the US average available through the EPA, again, the emission factors hub. And then we look at how much is delivered or shipped in a year. And we use the formula in order to calculate out what those emissions are. Now, you might be asking, kind of going back to this slide, why we didn't focus on all of them. I will say that we looked at a couple different factors on, how we chose which one of these to focus on and which one of these we chose to calculate. And there was a couple factors. One is what we could get our hands on in terms of data was one important one. Next one was what is material to our company. So where do we have the biggest impact when it comes to these scope 3? Using that spend-based modeling, we were able to determine where we should take that next step in order to look at proxy data or that average emission factors, and use that information to decide where we then take that next step to get supplier specific emission factors as well. So once we determined and calculated our scope 3 emissions, we were able to determine that it makes up about 58% of our total emissions for this specific example. Again, all 9 facilities go through this exercise, but for this example site that I'm bringing to the table, which is one of our biggest emitters in the company, it's 58%. And then you can see here that purchased goods makes up 63% of the emissions. Upstream transportation makes up 11%, and then waste and wastewater make up 26%. And then I will say that commuting and corporate travel and downstream transportation are included in our assessment, but they were so small that they didn't even show up on the graph. So we were able to set our priorities for where we should focus on our decarbonization journey and reduction planning by focusing on these three. So for reduction planning, we identified some opportunities and then did some project tracking details. So this is a list of all the details that we capture for the different projects. So we identified what the site is, what the source of the reduction planning comes from. Is it an ideation from an employee? Did it come from a third-party consultant? Did it come from, external consultant that we worked with, or engineering firm? What the action is, if it's available versus if it's planned, meaning is it something that's already available and just we don't have it built into our 10-year plan, versus do we already have it set in stone and we have plans to implement it? What the reduction type is, the year that the project starts and the year that the project ends, versus what's the first full year that we'll have realized the results of the project, which can sometimes be different. You want to know when your first full year of realization will be, of when you see those reductions. The implementation costs, the savings, and the return on investment, as well as what the savings in tons of CO2 is per year. With that, we've been able to identify some projects. So for this specific site, scope reduction planning, we've been able to identify 4 major projects that would lead to a 30% reduction in our scope 3 by 2030. One of them was upstream transportation. We put a range limit on our suppliers, meaning that we would only take from suppliers that were within 700 miles of this facility. That would save us a significant amount of CO2. We also looked at upstream transportation and worked with our hauler to improve on the mile per gallon that their trucks are traveling. So our hauler was going to improve on their mile per gallon, meaning that we would see an improvement in greenhouse gas emissions from that. On the waste side, we found a vendor that could take our organic waste and turn it into methane for energy capture. And so we saw a reduction in there instead of our material being sent for composting or being land applied. And then purchased goods, we have a lot of suppliers that have net zero plans as well. So we were able to take those into consideration and look at that reduction planning that they had in place. And so, as I mentioned, that got us to our 30% reduction on our scope 3. So some of our successes and challenges, our successes, we had internal buy-in and support for, doing our scope 3 assessments, and agreeing on a scope model was big. So everybody agreeing that we're going to stick with cradle to gate, and using the greenhouse gas accounting method was important. We had good mapping of our energy, water, and waste metrics, which was helpful for some of these metrics. And we had most of the internal reports and data required for the calculation methods that we needed in order to go through the process. So our challenges was finding all the emission factors. We did partner with a third-party consultant to help us do this and find all the emission factors that we needed for some things. Otherwise, things that were available, like the the EPA emission factors hub, that was pretty easy to access. It's publicly available and updated every year. The dedicated time to complete the calculations, it is a lengthy time-consuming process to do the calculations and set up the spreadsheets and modeling that you need in order to do the calculations. Now I said we had most of the internal reports and data available. I'll say not all data and information was readily available. So we had to do some digging and get some things set up correctly for some employees to access the data that we need. And then switching to The supplier-based emission factors, obviously supplier engagement is a tough thing to handle with all the suppliers that you have and working on that in supplier engagement. But you know, we're heading down that journey. We're just in the beginning stages of that supplier engagement journey, and we're hopeful that as we continue to have those conversations, that they'll get easier and easier over time. So with that, that's the end of the slides and talking points that I had. I'll open it back up to questions from the group for either myself or the 3 Degrees team.
Michelle, we did have one question in the chat about how you're measuring waste picked up by haulers. For example, Waste Management, you know, so container sizes. Yeah, how are you measuring that?
Yep. So most of our waste haulers do have weight stations that they report the actual weights to us on the invoices. So luckily we have that. But for some of our sites, we do square footage of containers and translate that. And there is something that was put up by the EPA. It's very old and there is no update to it, but I can share it with Jessie and she can put it out there. But it helps you look at that square footage of dumpster sizes, and then for different wastes it helps translate it into like metric tons or pounds or short tons. So I can share that with Jessie and she can share it to the group, but it is something that we use for some of our sites that don't have the weights right on the invoices.
Great. And then Kurt was also asking if you use any software to support data collection.
We do not. So we are still spreadsheet based. So we do all this with spreadsheets, and it's worked so far for us. So, and we haven't had any issues. So, you know, pending everything keeps working for us, we'll probably continue down this path.
Great. And I had replied to him in the chat that just this week we did on Wednesday, greenhouse gas in our working group. We specifically talked about data management platforms. So if anyone else is interested in that, you can reach out to me. I can share that recording if you're not a part of that working group. Great. Any final questions for Michelle or the 3 Degrees team? Great. Well, I will make these recordings available so you'll have access if you're a member through the member portal if you need to refer back to them. Otherwise, thanks so much for joining us today.